Hello, good afternoon everyone, and good afternoon Milena Dragićević Šešić. It's a great pleasure to have you in the Salon Insula 42. Milena, we haven't seen each other for a long time.
Quite a long time, absolutely.
Quite a long time.
But it's nice to see you at least through Zoom, and I hope we will meet in Bucharest or Belgrade soon.
Absolutely. I'm just going to mention the fact that we decided in last minute to do the conversation in English because we wanted it to be listened by probably more people, but we can ensure also that other salons are going to be spoken in French. And Milena is also a French speaker, and we very often in our previous lives attended conferences in French, and we still do. Now, Milena, we know each other for so many years. You are such an amazing international expert, professor, mentor, tutor. You for many generations of cultural managers and cultural policy makers, you dedicated your life to encouraging arts and also policy. You wrote so many books and so many articles. We even wrote one article together, I remember. And at the fall of communism, we did share this moment when, together with other people, with a small group of other people, we believe very hard that culture and cultural policy is going to be a central domain of reform in Eastern and Central Europe and in Southeastern Europe. And also I want to add that you do have a lot of activity that you developed also in Asia, in India, and in Arab countries. So you always witness this kind of complex transitions from one reality to another. But because now we are in the middle of this very precise moment of war again, right? I would start with something that I found in a book published by the European Cultural Foundation a couple of years ago.
2015, in fact.
Sorry?
2015.
2015. It was celebrating a number of years of capacity building in Eastern Europe. And there's an interview of a founder and director of a foundation called in Ukraine, Symbolum Sacrum Foundation, a foundation that was aimed by its founder, young founders, to develop the context in Ukraine and ensure that the context changes. And the director of this foundation, her name is Marina Kawinska, says, the role of culture in times of upheaval and war should not be underestimated. Ukrainian society is in ferment, looking for new and better solutions to old problems. Its people full of curiosity and eager to express their ideas, and cultural life across the country is booming. Even projects that predated the revolution are performed with new vigor. She's speaking about the Maidan years and 2014. And it's very touching to read all her interview because it's full of hope. This full of hope that we also had in the early post-communist years, full of hope that former Yugoslavia, Milena, both of us know because we were together also while the war in Bosnia took place, and we also were together when the bombing of Kosovo and Belgrade took place. So I would like to start our conversation with the following question. Why do you think that despite the presence of so many foundations, Western organizations, Council of Europe, very many cultural institutes, as we always said, on the territory of former communist countries why do you think that still this change of the society, change of the mentality of politicians was so difficult? In my opinion, this is a sort of a failure. I mean, so much was invested and still it's a failure. What are the reasons, do you think, Milena?
I think that there are many reasons why this value changes and contextual changes had not happened exactly in former Eastern European societies, because several issues. One is a complex situation that is linked, that's specifically for Russian case, loss of its previous importance and difficulty of people to understand that they're not part of the country that has any role anymore and that is under patronizing of more or less whole world, but let's say Western world. On the other side, other countries of Eastern Europe had a complex, unsolved national issue. And Ukraine was one of them, where nationalism was retaken instead by public institutions to help create healthy national culture, Ukrainian language promotion and everything linked with literature, arts, and so on. It was somehow those institutions mostly without any, let's say, strength. Civil society more linked to modernization of the country, westernization, open to literature that was forbidden. Let's translate from Hayek to Freud and so on. So the national issue was left to the far right-wing people in Romania, in Serbia, in Bosnia, in all three nations, and in Ukraine. So the monuments to the, let's say, Ukrainian Liberation Army, that was fascist army during World War II, started to be proliferating. Even this government of Zelensky didn't stop it. So why? Because our politicians do not want to stop or to criticize or to prevent actions done by right-wing civil society groups that are taking patriotism as theirs, it's only theirs and so on, because they think that's going to bring them more votes, more points in future elections. So somehow everything is linked to the to the polls, what population think and how, but in fact, this population is so manipulated by the voice of civil society in spite of this effort. And in spite of the not small money invested in capacity building of civil society, cultural organization, art residencies, and so on, however, most of this money was linked to projects that were linking us, people from Romania, Ukraine. I was many times, and now my heart is really breaking. I was in Kharkov just before pandemics. We visited different cultural organizations. I was with a group of Belarus cultural operators also, people who are totally opposed, and now they are very vocal and very opposed to Lukashenko regime and so on. So yes, in all these countries exists civil society that is open, that understand evils of this kind. In case of Putin, it's not even nationalism, it's a dream about old power, Tsarist power. Not only, not even Soviet, but Tsarist. Because you see,
imperial power.
Yeah, they're not really attacking those that Soviet Union was, let's say, adding or later on, but those that were part of this Tsarist empire and so on. And it's as one Russian artist told me, 𝐼𝐥𝐞𝐳 in 1999. He came after bombarding of Belgrade and so on, and many, Dan Perzhowski came. Many artists from Europe came this summer to show their solidarity and so on. And he told me, you know, during Yeltsin time, we were lost. We were completely without any hope, anything, because they have taken from us conviction that we live in the most just country of the world, country that is fighting for people. So we understood that why we live so badly. It's because we are supporting Vietnam, Cuba. So we are making sacrifice for the others. We didn't understand that that's about our nomenclatura, living another sort of life and so on. But we now realized that our country was bad, evil, and that we are not respected. And this loss of respect, in fact, provoke all those sentiments. Okay, my answer was very long.
No, but I just want to go on with this because indeed this is very much linked to identity. It's a loss of identity. And when you join just identity, it's very easy to go into nationalism, and then you do not ban nationalism because, as you say, politicians want to gather votes, and nationalism is sometimes a very good vehicle for votes. But my question also mentioned this dimension, Milena. Okay, so this was the situation indeed, but there was a lot of investment into mobility grants. How do you open the minds of people in these kind of countries? How do you teach them? How do you assist them in being able to rebuild a context that is democratic, that is open, that is not imperialistic? And my question is this, it's also a question I ask myself still. How could this investment be more efficient? Because basically, it was not efficient. There was a lot of...
Not because it was linked to one same group in all of these countries. So we made, among ourselves, excellent ties with artists, curators from Czech Republic, from Russia, from Lithuania, and so on, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, etc., etc. Us in former Yugoslavia, we all now collaborate. We have a nice colleagues also in Albania, in Kosovo, Macedonia, and so on. But this stayed on this level of non-formal actors. And even if some of us, because I count myself, although all the time employed at public university, but I was always part of many different civil society movements in cultural sphere. And I'm still, for example, the face of the street and Center for Cultural Decontamination. I'm in the board of many civil society organizations. But exactly because of that, because of the foreign money supporting this kind of open-eye actions, it was all demonized and say, you see, those civil society organizations, they are corrupted by foreign money. This Mr. Soros, there is even the name for artists and curators of contemporary political arts in Yugoslavia. They call them Sorosoids. Like,
let's not give ideas to anyone.
But I know that there are, and still, for example, in Academy of Science on the recent elections, several people were not elected because there was anti-campaign for them, saying they're Soros people.
Yeah. But this happens in Romania too, huh? You know, this really happens also in Romania.
Everywhere. In Lithuania also, Poles have been probably a little bit more clever, so they called Soros Foundation Stefan Batory Foundation. It also says something about Polish nationalism.
And need for need for identity, a
Yes.
firm identity. But then, Milena, could this have been okay? So the fact that basically the investment went to this kind of autoreferential group, and this group was supposed by a Western thinking to be illuminating the rest.
Now we are coming to another issue. As a difference from the Western countries, civil society is seen by our regime as something evil, something that is changing identity, changing values, participating in globalization. So they don't support civil society that is bringing democratic ideas, meaning that it's very difficult unless just immediately after so-called colored revolution, that civil societies are supported. And then 5 years after those revolutions that happened to us, to Croatia, to Macedonia, and so on, they forget about civil society. They forget even about spaces they were giving for civil society to be capable to do something. So, for example, latest example, 𝐾𝐫𝐚𝐠𝐢, which was a fantastic example of public civil society partnership in Macedonia, in Skopje. Okay, the government wanted more money to sell this cinema than to, in fact, give it for operations of culture, of civil society. So you see that, in fact, civil society is not seen in Eastern Europe as a partner, but as adversary, because also the government are very much aware, especially our Vučić government, that civil society from Georgia, Serbia, Croatia, and so on, in fact, was always supportive and helpful in bringing down authoritarian regimes.
Absolutely.
And they usually, that's also, I mean, I'm a political person, so I'm also thinking that NGOs have to be involved in that. But after this already 30 years of transition, the authoritarian government in the region, such as Lukashenko, you see that after a year, people were going, marching, and so on. He succeeded in keeping the power because he knew how to, cut the heads of the leaders of different oppositional, cultural, media movements, and so on. So in most of those countries, I really admire dissidents in Russia. I think they're definitely more brave than us, for example, in Serbia, because we are not yet imprisoned. We are discredited, we are demonized, we are a lot of rumors, you know, just through tabloid press and so on, different pressures on your children, on your husband, wife, etc., etc. But however, it's not yet, yes, you lose the job. That's for not us in academia, because university has autonomy, but basically all the civil society, let's say, activists lost jobs if they have public jobs in schools, in municipality, in health services, and so on. So there is a risk, but in Moscow, you might lose your head, like Anna Politkovskaya, and you see how the prosecution and the judge system works. It reaches certain level. We know who killed personally, but who gave the money to this person to kill? It's not yet.
It's not yet clear.
Yes.
But Milena, precisely when we are speaking about this kind of enemy from within, as the civil society is seen, right? Then we come back to this notion of Borka Pavicevic, who was saying that one has to have decontamination centers. What was exactly the decontamination notion that Borka was speaking about in Serbia.
Exactly, to decontaminate ourselves and our values from stereotypes that were raising hatred toward others. I will tell you such stereotypes that exist in my country, among my nation, as the facts. And Center for Cultural Decontamination also wanted to show that those are not facts. For example, Serbia never led any conquering war in the history.
Yeah.
Then you ask the guy how then, from 12th to 14th century, Serbian kingdom enlarged. Was those people just join as a
Serbia.
Greeks, Bulgarians, and Albanians? Because our last king, that's again the paradox, our last king, he was crowned in Skopje as a king of Serbs, Greeks, Albanians, and Bulgarians. And that's also something interesting, because according to Western theory, nations never existed before 19th century, because in some of their countries, such as Germany, it was 19th century that created that, or in UK, Anglo-Saxon, this, that, and so on. But you see, in the Balkans, in 14th century, the king was not king of the land as feuds, as was in Western Europe, was a king of people. But of course, mythology, victimization, what to decontaminate? To decontaminate this nationalism who is making only us angels of in the surrounding, never did anything harm, but all the others did harm on us who were completely innocent. We don't know why these Albanians are doing rebellion. And there is my question very often is, when Serbian army came to Elbasan, the response is like, but in 1915, when we withdraw, and then from Elbasan to Greece. No, we went in the Second Balkan War, and we had to withdraw because French and Italians asked us to withdraw. We conquered that. That fact does not exist because we lived in a certain mythology, and that's a little bit similar, I would say not a little bit, quite a lot similar, with Russian on one side, but also Ukrainians on the other side. I'm not equalizing at all. And I'm always saying, when my friends and colleagues protest saying, but look, Montenegrians, look, Bosnians, look, Croats, especially Croats and so on. I say, look, we have the biggest nation in Yugoslavia. Biggest nation has a biggest responsibility. Same would be with Russians in Soviet Union. You cannot accuse that Soviet Union was falling apart because of what? Latvian and Lithuanian rebellion. No, they just, when it collapsed, they just took their historical rights, and Ukrainians even have been a little bit late in all of that. And it's a very sad story when we hear today Russians and even Putin speaking about non-existence of Ukraine. Of historical non-existence. Look, it's so absurd because Ukraine was, as Lithuania was once upon a time, a big power, but it's not really, it's for me, the key question is how someone who is educated, who is creative, who is imaginative and so on, can follow such vocabulary. And I'm thinking here on certain group of Russian artists that enjoys this discourse of grandeur, discourse of Russia is going to be a great again, because we always know, even the Western countries, how they became great on the expense of people in their colonies. So the grandeur is always coming on the expense of someone else. But we hope that today we have to change the discourse. And it's not always that the embargo on Russia, I mean, I got even the letter from my colleagues from Italy that professor was asked to jump over his lecture about Dostoevsky. It's not time to discuss Dostoevsky today. I mean, that's really strange.
Yeah, and that we are going to a radical place. And then what you were saying, Milena, makes me just stress another time how much decontamination of preconceived ideas, historical ideas, which are very important, should be done, and not only in Serbia. I mean, I always found genius in Borka having nailed this term of decontamination. We have to decontaminate ourselves, deconstruct something using our critical thinking and using information and using history and facts.
May I laugh now, little joke about the word decontamination, because no one ever thought about our country as a nuclear country.
Yeah.
But once upon a time, our leader Tito had a dream to make Yugoslavia a nuclear country. And Vinča was developing fast, and our physicians, electro and whatever science is involved in this process, was developing till the event, I think it was 1961, but where the reactor exploded. And then the 6 scientists urgently have to be transferred to Paris, where they, for the first time ever, tested this transplantation of, from human body to human body. French people volunteered. That was the end of Yugoslavian nuclear dream. Most of these people survived, luckily. That was because it was the first time ever that they did it on the live persons who really have been radioactive. So decontamination was because we were also ready, and as a self-governing country and so on, we were and surrounded by enemies from all around. We developed also a culture of so-called citizen self-defense. So we were educated how to decontaminate ourselves from something that is outside you. And Borka's geniusity was that, in fact, she used this term to decontaminate us from inner pollution, inner, all this...
from the radiation of exterior ideas that we integrate as if they were the truth. So, Milena, now we are going to go back to this Dostoevsky story a bit later, because I want now, because we spoke so much about this very complex situation about why and how the post-communism reality really didn't match what sometimes the others tell it did match. I would like to ask you, precisely because you worked in India, Arab countries, and other you went all over
Mali, Cambodia,
and Africa, etc. Do you think that from this point of view, are there differences between Europe and those countries, and the transition and the post-totalitarian mentality in those countries and in Europe? Are there differences? Are there similarities? And which are these?
I can tell like this, that there is a bigger similarity in us coming from former Yugoslavia with India, Mali, and Cambodia.
Really?
Why? Because we belonged to something that was called non-aligned world. When we all together, India with Nehru, Egypt with Nasser, even Modibo Keita, Mali, and so Sirimavo Bandaranaike, so the leaders of the 60s, process of decolonization and process of creating a self-governing socialism in Yugoslavia was linked to an historical period where we felt important on the world scene. And that gave certain, how can I say, certain confidence in the people that they are not just some players. So when transition came, and in different countries, in India, they didn't have transition like we, but they had transition from kind of a solid, pretty authoritarian system of Congress Party, Indira Gandhi, and so on, to now very right-wing populist party. In Mali, it's a military government. So in Cambodia, that's even more disastrous because this it's completely authoritarian. It's the same government. It's basically, it's the same Khmer Rouge leader who was second in command, but he invited Vietnamese and he's still in the power. So it's probably the longest, and nobody cares. That's interesting, that in the West, nobody cares. So those countries feel more than I met in Hungary, Bulgaria, and so on. They consider foreign community unjust and that they are contributing to the collaborating with the leaders. That's exactly, for example, our feeling that Angela Merkel is directly guilty for our authoritarian leader of today. She and Germany brought him on the power. Tony Blair became his consultant. So it's, I mean, what we are discussing about, they give a drops of money to civil society, but their state logistics was going to opposition party, thinking that because the previous democratic didn't give to them Kosovo, this one is going for the power. Now this one is even more tough on the when they are solidified that power. The same with all these military rules in. So, but when I speak about it or show to the seminar, in the seminar and pictures, I see the same feelings. We had hopes. We dreamed about the decolonization and democracy. And then, because of petrol, for example, in Nigeria, or because of gems, stones, or lithium in Central African Republic and so on, in fact, the world leaders collaborated without authoritarian leaders. And that's exactly same what is happening, that our government is supported by all the world government. Why? Because of the mining, because their mining companies, Austrian, German, Australian, they want to take lithium out of Serbia. Unfortunately, we have, I said really unfortunately, 70 potentially extremely profitable mining fields. And in spite of the fact that it looks like that European Union is supporting civil society, in fact, each specific country is supporting much more their company who is directly opposing, and because of whom, for example, our government is saying that all these cultural and so-called ecological companies are corrupted. But in fact, they are corrupted through much bigger money of Rio Tinto and so on.
So in fact, it's this kind of double discourse, a very, very strong double discourse, which you find similar between the way things happened in the rest of the world that went through authoritarian kind of regimes and what happened in Europe, that there is a sort of a double measure in which
absolutely, because
each time this dynamics repeats itself. Now, Milena, if we come back to the war in Ukraine and what is going on there, what is your perspective and your take on the role that arts and culture and intellectuals have in this kind of situation, both in Ukraine and in Russia?
I think, yeah, let's start with the easier part, because I think it's clearly extremely important that all of us support intellectual and artists like 𝐿𝐢𝐥𝐞𝐬 𝐒, Lev Dodin, and so on. Those, not only that they are not supporting the war, they are directly opposed to the regime and so on, and they're really directly risking their life. I'm not saying that Putin is going to shoot them, but different right-wing groups, Nashi and so on, that were supported by the regime, always someone might be found that will think, that will really believe that he fulfills his patriotic duty by killing those, and very often Jewish. And that's anti-Semitism in Putin's Russia is once again, I mean, anti-Semitism in Russia and Soviet Union was a kind of ups, with a lot of ups and downs. So now it's a pretty high. So it's sometimes really very absurd when Putin say this fascism in Ukraine, while this fascism in Ukraine is really related to very few groups, like those fascist groups that exist in Russia also. So I think that's one important issue, to support all the voices, independent voices in Russia, of the artists, to invite them, not to say we embargo on Russia, so we don't, we suffered that. The foreign embassy in Serbia had a very bad role. They followed the rules totally, how would say?
Mechanically, in a mechanical way, yeah.
So they even told me once in a French embassy, sorry, we are here exactly to prevent persons in France to collaborate with you. The fact that I am dissident, that I am fighting against the regime, for them was not important. Okay, because we are Balkan, we find a way that I'm not sure that, but I also suggest to Europeans to use this way, because my Western colleagues, they had a lot of problems with that. That means I could travel, me or other activists, if they send us a private invitation, like they're inviting us to their home to visit them. That was possible. But many Western colleagues, they were under stress, how I'm going to write, and there it's going to be written. If something happens to me, they are going to pay for the hospitals and so on. In France, for example, you know, the family 𝐵oniel-Chalier, they got inspectors in their apartment to verify if they have enough square meters to host anyone from Serbia.
Yeah.
But that's, in fact, that was the moment when they realized how their authorities are behaving to all those, let's say, Algerians, Moroccans, when they are inviting families to visit, and so that their country is not that democratic as it pretends to be. So let's try to make everything possible to our colleagues from Russia take out. Of course, now comes the second answer. What to do for Ukraine in relations to arts and culture.
And what also, Milena, sorry, what also is the role that intellectuals and Ukrainians in Ukraine today, I mean, what kind of role they can have in this kind of very difficult, completely difficult, awful times? Because I know that you yourself, when being in Serbia, when you had this war-like situation, you tried very hard together with other people in the cultural community to resist in an intelligent way. So what can someone in war do when being an intellectual or an artist?
I would say that's the best example is what they did in Sarajevo after 4 years of siege. But I see that already happening in Kiev. We saw, I think it was yesterday, the Kiev Philharmonics performing on Maidan Square. But that was also significant. Out of 60 or 80, as many people Philharmonic Orchestra should have, there is only 22 today in Kiev. But yes, that's arts and culture might mobilize, offer empathy. So within the country, it's very important. I mean, although it sounds a little bit strange, small performances in shelters to keep children souls
elevated.
Yes, so it's not, if you are artist, writer, so storyteller. Let's do storytelling. That's the most oldest form of art expression. But this storytelling, regrouping of the people to listen storytellers, it's giving to the whole community sense. The composition, like we see diaspora is doing, creating some kind of music that is then sent to the people that are on the first line of front, that are in hospitals. I always think the doctors, you can imagine even now after 2 years of pandemic, totally épuisé, totally exhausted and so on, they're receiving now wounded, cut, and so on, and they have their families and they cannot think about their families and so on. Their spirit also, so it's not about Dr. Clowns, but we need really something that can be, that can offer space for reflection, and art can do it. A theater performance, that's something that in fact gives you not comedy just for the sake of fun. That's one thing inside. Outside of the country, I think it's really time to present Ukrainian culture as such, to compete, hold this theory of Putin and the Russian nationalists that Ukrainian culture doesn't exist. I'm sorry that I haven't received, but one Ukrainian NGO did, year before pandemics, did a research about what we know, what is known about Ukraine around the world.
Abroad.
And they've selected, I don't know how many of us intellectuals, and send those questions. And I have to say, I didn't know the response on 50% of those questions. On some names, they would put the name, and I didn't know who this person was. And that was obviously, I was writing this because, okay, this was online questionnaire. So I thought that we are kind of a well-educated, that we know this Ukrainian literature. There is a lot of links. There is, and by the way, once in 19th century, our priests were not educated in Russia. They've been educated in Tsarist Russia, but in Ukraine. That was their, space of education. So we have a lot of Ukrainian words, and there are links. And now you see our president breaking those links because of money, because of Russian gas. We are 95% depending on Russian gas. So, but we have...
Yeah, but then, Milena, what you are saying now is also a sort of a mirroring of your first statement in regard to identity, because basically it's through this cultural presence that has to become extremely alive, extremely strong, of the Ukrainian art and culture and figures and intellectual figures, that Ukraine can now manifest its identity. It's in the good sense, not in the sense that we are just telling about ourselves that we have this identity, but this identity is there. It's there through who we are through the intellectuals, through the artists, through the arts that they are doing. And indeed, it's very interesting to do this kind of research. Now, I have to say that I'm sure a lot of people don't know about Serbian or Romanian culture abroad. If we were to do a questionnaire, we will be surprised. And I'm very happy to say that luckily we did have this kind of burst of Romanian artistic, let's say, distribution through cinema in the last 10 years.
Absolutely,
Romanian cinema, and I'm always saying that. I say, you don't realize what an amazing breakthrough Romanian cinema was for the rest of the Romanian arts, because people started to say, hey, they have cinema, but who are their writers? Who are their singers? Who are, it's important to say that too. Let's go a little bit broader, Milena, in this conversation, and speak a bit about the frustration that both of us had during the 2000s and even the 90s, seeing how many misunderstandings were still surviving between the East and the West. And from a cultural point of view, I know that you already spoke about some of them, but from a cultural point of view, what do you think that are the strong misunderstandings staying still resistant? I'm just giving you an example. Anne Applebaum, whenever she's speaking about the West not understanding Russia, says, what you don't understand is the way that putting things that Russians think. You believe that they think like you do, but they don't. So one has to face the Russian thinking and the way of articulating strategies, etc., according to how those people think. What do you think, Milena, are the strongest misunderstandings still surviving after all these years between the East and the West?
Well, I think that one of the major issues is that even Central Europe, not to say Eastern Europe, is seen as not yet capable to be equal player on a political, cultural, economic, and so on scene. And it's true that economically, definitely, the situation was unequal. But I wouldn't say that on every other level, we couldn't be equal. But we were always putting as inferior, especially Eastern Europe, that so Central Europe was a political aim. The whole ideology of Central Europe, you see today, no one is speaking anymore about Central Europe. The work of Czesław Miłosz, of Kundera, and so on, they are not even read. But they've been extremely well read in 80s, when it was important to stimulate this perestroika give up of Central Europe. They never even wanted Belarus. People usually ask me, do they have their language? What language they are speaking? And then they cannot be, and they're not really interested. Everything beyond Polish borders stops to be interesting, or it's seen as something that is not rational. So they think that whole Eastern Europe is based on irrationalism, mysticism, so that all this Russian madness is part of this, although Putin is extremely rational. It's a KGB officer, so he might misuse this what we can say, village fool rhetorics and so on. But in fact, everything, Lukashenko, he knows absolutely what he is doing. So everything is very, very rational. But I think that very often we are seen, especially us in the Balkans, as this unknown other, irrational, that that's the reason why they liked so much 𝐂𝐸𝐧𝐚 movies, although we all know that they are exaggerated. But now we start to like it, because if you like that all of our marriages end up in a turmoil, although I never been on any that ended up in turmoil like in movies, but it somehow sounds nice and so on. So we are like unknown other, and there is a certain fear and labeled as corruptive. Although if the German Prime Minister becomes a Russian, whatever, board member for petrol, isn't that corruption? Much bigger than the corruption of a small Bulgarian custom officer who asked me 10 euros to leave the country. Yeah. And I didn't give, so I was late for 6 hours because I said I have nothing, and he don't want to let bus go if we all don't pay. That's past tense. That was 15 years ago, but it's a small corruption. What is the corruption of the big European corporations in Africa and so on, petrol corporation, etc., etc. So, but the label of corruption, of poverty, of readiness to do everything, what we don't want to do, surrogate mothers, this poor Ukraine. So if they really supported Ukraine, and that's, for example, the major feeling among intelligentsia in Serbia is that Ukrainian people were forced to war, given weapons and everything for war, for defense, but that's for war, while not given enough investment and money to live normally. That is the reason why Ukrainian government realized that it's better to be the only country in Europe that is going to make a law about surrogate mothers, so that the whole Europe can rent a body of Ukrainian women to produce a child, then to give them, to invest in economy so that they can live
in a normal
way. And I would say this is, no one is speaking about poverty that led so many Ukrainians to go in Russia to work, not in the West, but they were going also in the West to work on the, even to Serbia and so on. So they never got adequate help. So the East is bitter about it, that we never get, we were always pushed, uploaded. Belarus intelligentsia, for example, for 1 year they've been uploaded, but nothing. Not now they boycott Lukashenko, I mean, because of support to Russia and the war, but in fact, he was not really boycotted when he terrorized his own people. So it's not true that these people do not fight, or that the people have the government they deserve, because both sides, poor people, they think around identity. They want to conquer us, globalize, to destroy our whatever identity. Intelligentsia see that in fact they don't get any real support, substantial support to develop the country, because after revolution, after Maidan revolution, there was a lot of hope. There was, and then you see that it doesn't.
And you see that this hope again went down. And you see, Milena, I'm going to use this also very, very striking example in relation to some kind of image that sometimes the West has and was built also in years and stays there about the Romanians receiving with so much warmth and generosity the Ukrainian refugees, and also the fact that this was a surprise. While we all know that we are a very hospitable people and extremely generous and very kind of wanting to give ourselves and have guests, and this kind of attitude and the capacity that we had to organize ourselves was a surprise for the Western countries, which again makes me think that there is still a lot of misunderstanding in terms of how really the realities in our countries developed and how they really exist and how they really try to strive in very difficult and very volatile kind of situations.
I would exactly like to go, when they proclaim embargo, like they proclaimed embargo against Yugoslavia, the West is not aware how modestly we can continue to live, especially if the people think that that's unjust embargo.
Yeah.
Economic embargo is ruining the country, but people continue to live modestly. And just to finish the story, because it connects two of us also, during 1999, when NATO was bombarding Belgrade, and I got 3 invitations to come with my family abroad. One was coming from 𝐂𝐨𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐚 from Moscow. 𝐂𝐨𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐚, by the way, was in prison for several months just a year ago.
Oh my God.
Yes.
And what is he doing now, 𝐂𝐨𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐚?
He's at home, and I think he just withdraw off everything.
Everything.
And the second invitation was from Lidia Varbanova from Bulgaria, who said, we cleaned the grandma house in a village and so on, but the whole village knows and they wait for all your family. And the third was from you saying, come to Timișoara and so on. And I remember what I responded. I said, because we expect bridges to be bombed, we prepared our boat on our side of the river.
Yeah, I remember, Milena.
To cross that. But I haven't got any letter of this or similar kind, or even empathy from my Western friends, although they knew that I'm not part of the government terrorizing Albanians and so on. Even I got from our colleague from Salzburg a letter, keep strong. Bombardment is very healthy. That happened in 1944 for us, and it was very good. So, I mean, yes, it happened to Dresden, it happened to many, it happened, by the way, to Belgrade also. Allies were bombing us, thinking that they are bombing German soldiers, but in fact, the bombs were not that precise in that time. So it was Orthodox Easter. So that's also one prejudice, maybe, with a little truth in it, of my people. They think that the West is specifically, negative toward Orthodox nations. And now when we come out and say, but look, Ukraine has uniats and so on, and they in fact want to separate Ukraine. They support Ukrainian independent church. It's West who is financing and so on. So it's again, fragmenting orthodoxy, etc., etc. So this is one very, at least in my country, it's a kind of a stereotype that we are suffering because we are Orthodox. And then if you say, but Greeks are Orthodox, you see they're part already. But because there are always some intellectuals in those right-wing stories, so they are saying, but the West stolen the whole antique Greek culture. and interiorized it during humanism and Renaissance. Before that, they haven't had a clue, Germans. I mean, what they have to do with antique Greece. In the time of antique Greece, they didn't exist as a literate and historical nation. I repeat that because Friedrich Engels once, and even recently, you can hear that story that some nation is not, Slavic people are not historical nations. Why they are bothering this Ottoman Empire and taking arms, while Ottoman Empire is such a nice and fine country. Germany was really counting on that. So it's there is a lot of historical misunderstanding. There is also not only that we are interiorizing different stereotypes and prejudices, the West is also interiorizing and justifying strategic interest of their countries as truth, as normality. And if historical science show that that's not really, how I'd say, true, again, they think it's our, how would say, imagination, emotions, that we want to rationalize our non-success. So there is this division. It's not anymore Iron Curtain, definitely, but it's a kind of invisible curtain. And then I have to tell that also, I think it's important. In the UNESCO Technical Facility Group, expert group for cultural policy, we are around 35 from the whole world. And a German member launched a letter, let's make a letter to stop war in Ukraine, etc., etc. I responded immediately, and few other colleagues, yes, let's do it. And then our African colleagues and Arab colleagues said, would you like to sign a letter to stop the war in Palestine and Israel? Would you like to sign a letter for Yemen? Would you like, and it was such a powerful letter that our colleague Yari Kamara have written, and then all the others supporting, that I really was ashamed. Because and then Avril Joff from South Africa sent specifically to me extracts from different statements from major companies like Associated Press and so on, which when they interview people or take and so on. But those are people like us, Ukrainians. Those are blondes with blue eyes. When you see them walking, you see ourselves. They're nicely dressed, middle-class people. And around, she sent me, I think, 12 extracts from the press saying, what do you think? How we feel when we read this? Yes, it's something that we have to be much more aware how big Eurocentrism is, that this Eurocentrism wanted to take Ukraine in her arms. I would like to take us also in Eurocentric arms, but they're not taking us yet. Probably they will one day, but they are rejecting the others. So if we can discuss about NCAP, about different programs, ELIA, different programs of policies for culture, but European Cultural Foundation and so on. In 90s, Russia was there. Our Russian colleagues were there. Since Putin came on power, slowly they stopped coming. In 2012, in Krakow, on my explicit question, why 10 years, none of you is coming when we are gathering in Paris, Amsterdam, and so on, he told me, it's not well seen. So theoretically, you can go. But if you are going in the West, it's not well seen.
By the regime,
by the regime,
yeah.
By regime, but also your dean, if you are in the public institution.
The hierarchy is not seen you up.
Absolutely. So many people did not want to risk their, so I was invited for keynote speak on different conferences in St. Petersburg. At the beginning, I didn't realize, because inviting me, they don't risk. They invited Serbian person.
Yeah.
Probably no one is going to check what I'm speaking, and so on. They come with their students to us in Belgrade, and they say the maximum where we can go, nowhere else. But no one in Europe, neither EU, neither independent bodies such as European Cultural Foundation, even remarked that those Russians that led our networks in 90s, Kirill Razlogovin Circle, Misha Gniedovsky, 𝐂𝐨𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐚 𝐒, and so on, that they are not anymore, even not
active, yeah,
not totally withdraw and so on. So people started laughing. Some of my colleagues in Belgrade said, it's bigger money now in Russia, because you always see those tycoons. You don't see common people. So prejudices are everywhere. So embargo, cultural embargo, even sport embargo, I have to say, my heart was really broken for what is happening in Ukraine. But to prevent Paralympics, to go to Paralympics, somehow I didn't think it's just. There was a suggestion that they can go without as persons. And I think that would be legitimate in this situation. But even not to allow them to go, Olympics are every 4 years. For a sportsman, especially for the sportsman with a handicap, without leg, arm, and so on, next Olympics are too far away. So you deprived and you made people in those countries under embargo even more angry. And what embargo succeeded? Cuba, Americans, who suffered have they changed regime? No. Castro's are there. And who suffered? The most common people suffered. Embargo under Iraq, embargo under Vietnam only made sick people not to get enough quality, I saw in Vietnam, not all of the victims of American bombardments are having wheelchair. So you see many people in Saigon, in Ho Chi Minh City, scrolling on the streets because they don't have legs and so on. So embargo under one country is only affecting the weakest and reinforcing mafia linked to the regime, because mafia is always going to find ways of selling, buying, survival and development. So cultural embargo, I'm not for, although in cases of prominent supporters of war regimes, prominent supporters, I would think really, I would invite them personally. I wouldn't even communicate with such person. In my country, I am not communicating with nationalists, with those that hate other nations. If they tell that publicly, or even if they tell that to me privately, I stop communication. Why I have to befriend and to be
together with someone who doesn't have your values?
Absolutely. And so that I don't call embargo. That I think is a part of what we are always doing. It's a selection, it's a programming, and we are choosing someone.
To isolate those people, to isolate them, but to isolate them because they are active promoters of something that we don't agree with at all. Now, Milena, a last question, because unfortunately time is always very short in the salons. And my question is in regards to cultural diplomacy. What do you think cultural diplomacy could do in this kind of tense, complicated, and destructured moment. I mean, you and 𝐶 were writing this book about the turbulent times. Well, apparently times become more and more turbulent. And from whatever you said, it's very obvious that you are not only an intellectual and someone who is a scholar and an expert and an internationally renowned professional in cultural policies and researcher and cultural management, but also someone who's very activist, kind of very involved, very much involved in in one's own beliefs. So what do you think, last question, cultural diplomacy should look like these days?
Oh, I think it should be most active on both levels of public cultural diplomacy, but also on the level of citizens' cultural diplomacy. So, because everything what, for example, your country don't want to do or want to present as within their own cultural diplomacy program, which sometimes might be completely wrong or completely based on propaganda art. Recently, my student made a thesis about failed Chinese cultural diplomacy. So China is the biggest investor in Serbia, but has terribly bad image in spite of the thank you Mr. Xi of our president, my brother Xi, and etc. etc. So the politicians are perfect friends, but image in the people is terribly bad, and in literature and in everything. And then public cultural diplomacy of China is sending always some exhibitions and so on, but people perceive that as propaganda. Even people who I don't go there, I don't know, maybe it's not always, maybe it might be sometimes even something of quality, but people, the very moment they hear that that's organized by Confucius, by embassy, that's propaganda. So in the arts, literature, so being present, but by curated program by independent persons, supported by public diplomacy, everywhere in the world is one of the very important tasks for public diplomacy. Not that they curate, but that they let public institutions independently curate on one side. On the other side, it's really important for civil society movements to try to be even more active in international affairs. I would say that, in fact, Ukraine was Russia was not doing much, but it was doing a lot by creating a lot of festivals and manifestations in like this one multimedia art museum in Moscow, from this biennial the artists from Western Europe started with the drawing. And that has a logic, because we have to know that these kind of manifestations are part of public diplomacy of Russia, supporting in Moscow, throughout Russia, important art events, so that curators can bring celebrities, Western artists, and so on. That means support. That means really supporting effectiveness of public diplomacy. Ukraine was not having such a kind of world prestigious manifestations, although it's strange to think how they neglected cultural diplomacy to be more active. It's even more important to bring people to your country to a big, massive manifestation than to send one artist on one concert, one on some. It's like with Romanian film. You made a festival of Romanian film in New York, and then it's impactful because that's something that people can retain. It's not, oh, I saw yesterday a film from Azerbaijan and that's it. That's it. But something more comprehensive has to be done.
Milena, thank you so much for this presence. I have to say that because you mentioned Kundera, Milan Kundera, one of my favorite parts of well, it's just a fragment of his intimate journal where he says that a friend of his, while the fall of communism came, told him, oh, where is there Balzac to tell the story of the fall of communism? And then Kundera answered, you know, artists are not the drummers of history. We, the bureaucrats and politicians, are always believing that their time is equal to the artist's time. But the artist's time is very different from the bureaucratic and political time. And it made me think about this kind of ongoing conversations that we do have to keep having among us in the region and internationally, and how precious all this is, despite the fact that sometimes we don't see each other for years, we don't speak to each other for many weeks, and then all of a sudden we see that these bridges are never broken. No bomb can break this kind of humanistic, spiritual bridge.
Thank you, Corina. Absolutely agree.
And hope to see you in June, and let's hope that by then this war will be ended and that we will all learn a lesson about us and about how to do things better in the future.
This war is awful, and I hope also that it's going to end very, very soon. And strong Ukraine.
Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao, Milena. Thank you.